Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 261 by Xietain's Fifth Skill, Part 1. When the enemy soul evolvers suddenly lost all will to fight against her, Shangguan Bing Shui sneered. She waved her hand gently, and the several ice walls erected by her at the entrance to the villa courtyard collapsed in an instant. Bai Xietain and Nangong Lingxin walked into the courtyard with leisurely steps and stopped beside Shangguan Bing Shui amidst the pools of blood formed from the blood of those who were killed before by the Ice Princess. Nangong Lingxin looked at the surroundings, and although she already expected something similar, she couldn't help but be taken aback. She even saw the head of a powerful soul evolver on the ground. After all, Nangong Lingxin had been part of this group in the past, so she easily recognized Ying Kuan. Nangong Lingxin. Two surprised voices sounded at the same time. Shan Li and Kong Rong seemed to forget the existence of Shangguan Bing Shui, who had just overwhelmed an entire group of soul evolvers, and they completely ignored Bai Xietain. The two men's gaze was instantly fixed on Nangong Lingxin from the first moment she appeared within their line of sight. It's been a week since we last saw each other, Kong Rong, Shan Li. Nangong Lingxin smiled elegantly and looked at the two men in front of her calmly. If Bai Xietain and Shangguan Bing Shui did not know the history between the two parties, they might even have thought that this was a group of three friends meeting after a long time without seeing each other. Of course, although Nangong Lingxin's reaction was seemingly casual, the same could not be said for the other two. Bitch! Kong Rong burst out in fury as he pointed toward her nose and cursed loudly. After I gave you and your family a place to live inside the walls of my camp, this is how you pay me back. You treacherous King whore. Nangong Lingxin's expression grew cold. In the past she had never been treated in such a manner, and from the moment she became a powerful soul evolver her pride towards her existence naturally increased. Even powerful people beyond all sense like Shangguan Bing Shui and Bai Xietain treated her with due respect. How could she tolerate a fat, useless man talking to her like that? Treacherous? Me? Don't make me laugh. Watch your words, you ungrateful pig. Do you forget all the contributions my brother and I have made to this corruption-ridden base? Nangong Lingxin sneered, the anger in her voice obvious to anyone who would listen. But not only did you not thank us, you even let that good-for-nothing of your good son try to force himself on me with a bunch of scumbags. If it wasn't for my brother, do you know what situation I would be in? Who is the treacherous one here? I think we are all clear. My son. Right, where is my son Kong Hong? Kong Rong seemed to realize something and suddenly became livid. He ignored most of Nangong Lingxin's words, dismissing them as nothing but air. Nangong Lingxin. Don't you dare lie to me, or otherwise dash. Otherwise, what? Nangong Lingxin interrupted coldly. Her lips curved upward slightly and she said in a sarcastic tone, will you order your armed troops to attack me? Or maybe you'll have your evolved dogs attack me as a group. Why don't you give it a try then? This time I'm not alone and take my brother's place to see your head roll on the ground tonight. Nangong Lingxin would never forget how she was almost raped in the past and how her father was fatally wounded as she and her family fled south. If not for her brother and Bai Xiein's group, she and her only two family members would have met an extremely miserable fate because of Kong Hong. However, the main culprit of it all was undoubtedly Kong Rong for allowing such things to happen. If there was one person Nangong Lingxin could never forgive, no matter what, it was the man in front of her. Kong Rong's eyes widened and he bellowed, didn't you hear my question? I asked you where my son is. Answer me, or I'll be sure to break your legs and throw you on the streets of the west side of the base for the lowest hobos to turn you into the lowest bitch. If it were in the past, Nangong Lingxin might have been frightened by such a threat. After all, although Kong Rong didn't have any real power, he was a very smart person and with different tactics managed to control several soul evolvers without losing control over the firearms and cops subordinate to him before the apocalypse. However, things were very different now. But just as she was about to say something, another person interrupted. Hey, pig. Are the beds in your villa comfortable? Kong Rong was taken aback as the sudden intermission was too abrupt. For a moment he didn't know what to say and looked in white at the young man wearing black armor and a huge sword behind his back. Why did he want to know if the beds in his villa were comfortable? Who are you? Kong Rong asked with a grim face. He would temporarily put the matter of Nangong Lingxin aside and deal with the two strangers. He would have plenty of time to make that woman pay for what she did. Bai Zemin frowned slightly and activated second-order blood manipulation silently. Cough. Kong Rong's face turned pale and he clutched his chest tightly as he was forced to cough out a mouthful of fresh blood. The pain he felt sent him back a few steps, and had it not been for Shan Li hurriedly supporting him, he would have fallen straight to the ground. You've been acting as if you're the king of the world, and to be honest, you've already become a pest. Bai Zemin said coldly and ordered indifferently, now you only have two choices. Give up and die quickly, or continue fighting, which as a consequence will give you such a gruesome death that you can't even imagine. Choose. It had already been over a month since the soul record changed the earth forever. From day one, Bai Zemin had been high in power and had gradually grown accustomed to speaking in an imposing tone of voice when he wanted something. The current him was a world away from that normal college student and could easily be compared to people with great power before the apocalypse as far as noble aura was concerned. The only reason he had not killed Kong Rong was because if he could get him to surrender, it would be easier for Bai Zemin to take control of the armed troops he controlled. However, his patience was running out after listening to Kong Rong's arrogance and insults. In fact, Shangguan Bingshui did not even say a word and did not even look at them. She looked up at the night sky and seemed disdainful of looking at, let alone talking to, the two men in front of her. Chief. Just as Kong Rong was about to fly into a fit of rage, Shan Li's voice sounded beside him in a whisper, I think that silver-haired woman is not the leader, on the other hand, that young man. I even feel danger when my eyes meet his. Shan Li was a powerful soul evolver of level 35, quite close to Shangguan Bingshui's level. In the past, he and his family were saved by Kong Rong, which led him to obey and protect him as thanks for this deed. Shan Li was not only powerful, but he was also quite intelligent. But the problem was that when he looked at the young man with black armor and a big red sword behind his back, Shan Li felt that his probability of victory did not necessarily exceed 50% since just now he could not even see how Bai Zemin attacked Kong Rong even though he was by his side and everything was happening before his eyes. Hearing this, Kong Rong's face turned even paler and disbelief flashed in his eyes. He was aware of how powerful Shan Li was, so hearing that even he had no confidence in defeating the young man in front of them, the surprise Kong Rong felt could be imagined. As for you. Bai Zemin looked at Shan Li and shook his head, even though you are strong, you will have to die. It was you who sent Evangeline to attack us today, wasn't it? Although Shan Li was stronger than Evangeline, Bai Zemin knew that the beautiful assassin with mixed blood would definitely not forgive him after knowing that she was tricked and almost killed by the other side's schemes. From Bai Zemin's point of view, Shan Li might be more powerful, but his value was far less than Evangeline's in his eyes. This was because Evangeline would soon be following him wholeheartedly, but getting Shan Li to follow him without further thoughts would be more difficult than ascending to the heavens since he seemed to be quite close to Kong Rong. Therefore, although it was a shame, Bai Zemin's murderous intent towards Shan Li only grew more and more. A powerful soul evolver like Shan Li could cause a huge commotion if Bai Zemin allowed him to escape today. Lord Shan. Let's fight them together, that's right. With you here, I refuse to believe that these three people can cause any more troubles. Two soul evolvers stepped forward, a man and a woman. In the past, the two of them had seen Shan Li make a first-order beast kneel down as if it was waiting to be sacrificed for him. Although the silver-haired woman had left a great impression on their minds, to them Shan Li was a supreme existence that had helped them evolve. Noisy. Bai Zemin looked coldly at the two who spoke. The man and woman froze in their tracks. Bang! Bang! Before the two soul evolvers could say a single word, their bodies swelled rapidly before exploding. Warm blood splattered everywhere and flesh along with incomplete limbs flew through the air before falling to the grass and dyeing its color to red. When I gain control of this base, you will be able to work for me. Those who oppose me or who dare to raise their hands against me will be mercilessly executed. Bai Zemin's cold voice was brimming with domineering attitude and the expression of the 12 soul evolvers froze. None of them doubted what the young man was saying as previously they did not even see nor could they comprehend how their two comrades suddenly exploded into a bloody mess. The armed men watching from afar also did not dare to do anything even though Kong Rong was cornered. Most of them were just survivors who had recently been recruited into the armed forces, and the reason they were fighting was so that they could live a better life. Why would they be willing to sacrifice themselves for someone else? Not to mention that most of them had never even seen Kong Rong once in their lives, as they only received orders through an intermediary. Shan Li's face became serious, and he took a step forward as he said, "Although we had a dispute with Nangong Lingxin and her brother in the past, that has nothing to do with you. As for the matter of tonight's assassination, I apologize for that. Why don't you join us? I know you are strong, but I am strong too. If we both fight, who lives and who dies is not clear. Why don't we put the problems of the past behind us and focus on a better tomorrow? With you and me being the core, the power of the general base will increase tremendously, and we can all live better lives as well as secure a better future for ourselves." Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 262 by Xietan's Fifth Skill, Part 2. Hearing Shan Li's words, the soul evolvers under Kong Rong's control were very surprised. Usually, Shan Li was quiet but very proud of himself, and except for Kong Rong, to whom he had an unpaid life debt, he was not willing to lower his head to anyone. He even did not give a good face to the strongest soul evolver under Li Yuan, the other leader of the North Camp. However, that same Shan Li was now trying not to fight against the young man in front of him, a young man who was clearly barely 20 years old. What did this mean? The soul evolvers and Kong Rong realized that things were much more complicated than they thought. Although they had somewhat expected it when they saw how a single glance from the young man in black armor was enough to make the bodies of two soul evolvers explode into a bloody mess, only now did they realize that their lives were in real danger. At this point, the 12 soul evolvers did not dare to offend the group of 3 people in front of them easily and obediently backed off. After all, the black-armored youth had already told them that they could all live and work for him without losing their privileges in the future as long as they did not become his enemy. Even a small squad of 10 other soul evolvers who had just arrived at the battle zone did not stupidly jump into combat after seeing the situation inside the courtyard. Kong Rong naturally noticed the change in the attitude of those who were usually willing to do practically anything to please him, and his face sank. However, there was nothing he could do about it at this point. Because he was just an ordinary person with no real power. Shangguan Bingshui gave Shan Li a sidelong glance, and her eyes flashed with a hint of disdain. This man clearly didn't know Bai Zemin's personality, or otherwise he wouldn't be wasting his breath saying such meaningless words. Indeed. Bai Zemin shook his head and took a step forward as he said indifferently, "As I said before, today you have to die, and since I decided to kill you, then naturally you will die." Shan Li narrowed his eyes, and a hint of coldness flashed in his gaze. "Although you are strong, you are too arrogant. That arrogance might be the reason for your downfall today." After saying these words, Shan Li took a step forward, and the murderous intent exuding from his body began to increase. The faces of some of the nearby soul evolvers turned pale, and they quickly stepped back as they looked at him in fear. Murderous intent in light novels might seem like a fantasy, a false lie. However, those who had killed a certain number of living beings actually possessed such an aura. The so-called murderous intent was actually the danger in the form of pressure that an individual could impose on others. However, the murderous intent only worked on those who posed a lesser danger than the one who released such pressure. Bai Zemin's expression remained unchanged. He emulated Shan Li and took a step forward. His dark eyes stretched into a slit as he released all the pressure in his body boosted by his own mana. Bang! The surrounding wind seemed to burst outward like an air bullet, and Shangguan Bingshui and Nangong Lingxin were forced back with slightly pale faces. The soul evolvers and Shan Li looked at the seemingly invisible but faintly scarlet glowing aura surrounding the black-armored youth, and their expressions turned quite ugly, especially Shan Li's expression. It was as if he had accidentally eaten a live fly. "To you, maybe I'm being arrogant." Bai Zemin spoke as he took another step forward. His voice was chilling to the point where comparing him to a demon from the legendary hell would not be an exaggeration. "However, there is a woman who knows me better than anyone else since this world went to shit, who always thinks that I underestimate myself too much." Shan Li began to feel the pressure on his body increase for every step Bai Zemin took forward. Instead of wondering what he meant by what he said, what Shan Li was wondering in alarm was how many living beings this young man had killed. In fact, the number of living beings that Shanli and Bai Zemin was similar. At least that was until Bai Zemin made over 100,000 mutated spiders explode into a blood mist in the forest before fighting the second-order archaic bear. As for Shangguan Bing Shui, she knew by instinct that the person Bai Zemin was talking about was Lily. After all, everyone knew that the two of them were incredibly close. Perhaps, the reason I underestimate myself is because I am comparing myself to other unknown existences. Bai Zemin continued walking and only stopped when he came face to face with Shanli. Their heights were quite similar, so their eyes were practically aligned. However, if I compare myself to you, then you are like a naive and innocent child who stupidly thinks he can defeat an experienced adult. Completely nonsense. Shanli narrowed his eyes and said coldly, if you hadn't approached me. If you had prevented me from approaching you, then maybe you could have a 50% probability of victory. However, now that you are in front of me, you can only die. After saying this, Shanli's eyes opened abruptly and a pale gray rune that was deeply engraved in his soul flashed as he activated his skill. Bang, rumble. The ground sank heavily downwards and the concrete seemed to take a huge hit as it exploded into hundreds of small fragments that were soon turned into dust. Bai Zemin's body also sank heavily downward and the weight of his equipment suddenly seemed to abruptly increase several levels. In fact, his back began to curve slightly due to the weight of the greatsword behind him and he seemed to be making a great effort to stand on his feet. Oh? Shanli raised an eyebrow in surprise. His lips curved slightly and his arrogant voice echoed throughout, I'm surprised that you can still stand even after being affected by my gravity manipulation skill. Well, although I bet at this point you can't even speak, let alone move, ha ha ha. Shangguan Bing Shui's expression darkened slightly as she observed from afar. Even from a distance of over 20 meters, she could feel the dreadful pressure in that part of the atmosphere. She knew that even she might be forced to kneel down as her strength stat was not particularly high at the moment. Nangong Lingxin was also anxious. Although she had already told Bai Zemin about Shanli's skill, even though she had confidence in the strength of the young man she had known for only a couple of days, the situation didn't seem to look good for him. Shanli, kill him. Kong Rong ordered viciously and hatefully from a distance. Kill him and capture those two bitches alive. I'll make sure they spit out everything they know before I make them regret being born. Seeing that the black-armored youth did not respond to his words and hearing Kong Rong's voice filled with urgency behind him, Shanli silently pulled out a sharp dagger from his belt. We could have made a great team together, but as I said, your arrogance will one day be the reason for your downfall. Shanli raised his dagger, crafted from the bones of a first-order beast, and as he looked at Bai Zemin, he lamented, unfortunately for you, that day came sooner than expected. Then, he simply slashed downward with the intention of piercing the young man's brain in front of him. The stab seemed to be just a normal stab, however, the speed at which Shanli's hand moved was similar to lightning. Swoosh! Just when most believed that the battle was over before it even began, Bai Zemin raised his left hand and caught Shanli's wrist in mid-swing. The tip of the dagger flashed in the reflection of the moonlight, releasing a horrifying glow just inches from his head. What? Shanli was shocked and shouted out loud, you can still move? Impossible, impossible? The cold voice with a tinge of ridicule echoed throughout the courtyard. Bai Zemin slowly raised his face and his eyes, which were so far being covered by part of his hair, met Shanli's. Not only can I move, I can also do this. Before Shanli could react, Bai Zemin swung his right fist at lightning speed, taking advantage of the enemy's shock, and punched him fiercely under the chin. Bang! Shanli's body was sent flying into the sky, flying a dozen meters high in a second. Lord Shan, Shanli, the Soul Evolvers and Kong Rong were startled when they witnessed this. That previous strike had resounded everywhere, and even if Shanli was still alive, he would definitely not be intact, which would diminish his combat ability greatly. Shangguan Bing Shui's expression returned to normal as if nothing had happened, and she nodded to herself. Nangong Lingxin unconsciously let out a sigh of relief and patted her generous breasts lightly. She had been on the verge of cardiac arrest before. Bai Zemin, now relieved of the immense pressure he felt earlier, looked up to the sky and activated blood manipulation. Swoosh! 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 The blood of the Soul Evolvers killed earlier suddenly glowed with a faint bright scarlet radiance. Like self-conscious snakes, the blood split into several parts and flew into the sky at full speed, hardening more and more and reaching Shanli in just an instant. In pain, Shanli opened his eyes as wide as he could, only to feel a dozen of blood chains wrapping around his body and limbs as they held him afloat in midair. His mind went blank for a moment due to the previous punch, and he felt as if his brain had been smashed by a huge hammer. Shanli didn't know how such a thing was happening. With his gravity manipulation skill increasing gravity inside a certain range by a total of 28 times, the black-armored youth should not be able to move. He shouldn't be able to move unless... Shanli looked down and his gaze met the black-armored youth's as he said, "Bastard. Your strength stat is over 300 points. Xietain moved his shoulders back slightly and made his bones creak. In fact, Xietan's strength was considerably close to 400 points. It was precisely for this reason that he managed to resist the pressure of the skill gravity manipulation, which caused the weight on him to increase by a total of 28 times, and which as a consequence required 280 strength points to fight against such an abrupt increase. The reason why Shanli had not died after being hit in the head by Xietan's fist was because although the latter's strength stat had not dropped, 280 of his 359 were being used to withstand the gravitational increase. In fact, had it not been for the physical attack power of his Skullbreaker glove, Shanli would not have been sent flying so high. After all, Xietan's fist contained less than 100 strength points. But all this was something no one needed to know. Xietain naturally would not say such things in front of so many people as they were vital secrets for his own survival. Why not kill him yet? Nangong Lingxin asked in a whisper. Shangguan Bingshui also furrowed her eyebrows slightly and confusion flashed in her eyes as she shook her head slightly. Xietain was just looking at Shanli as if he was waiting for something instead of finishing it. This left her confused, so she could only wait and see. In any case, the winner was already clear for anyone to see. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 263, Xietan's Fifth Skill, Part 3 Last. While Shangguan Bingshui and Nangong Lingxin were confused about Xietan's actions, Kong Rong felt as if he was a fish out of the sea and placed on a chopping block waiting to be slaughtered. With the clear defeat of Shanli, his most trusted and powerful fighter, this man who had been in power for so long without remembering what it meant to fear for his life finally realized that he was not an all-powerful god capable of deciding on his fate. Before the apocalypse, as chief of the Tinyuan Town police station, Kong Rong always lived a good life. His orders in the small town were basically imperial decree and there was no one who dared to go against him. When the apocalypse broke out and the world changed, Kong Rong's life did too. However, his base was not affected in the least, and from a certain point of view, he even became stronger. Making use of his intelligence and taking advantage of the fact that his only family was his son Kong Hong, Kong Rong mobilized his well-armed troops to clear a safe zone by himself. After securing a part of the North Camp and teaming up with the chief of the Linji Town police station, Kong Rong's power was further stabilized. For him, the apocalypse was nothing but a blessing, as although he was not extremely lustful like his son or Shanli, he was still a man with desires. Thus the fact that he could enjoy women who in the past would never pay attention to him was a great boost to his ego. Enjoying beautiful women without forcing them and offering good deals, deciding who lived and who died, having powerful soul evolvers under his rule even though he was just an ordinary human. All this was about to disappear before his own eyes. Worst of all, as he looked at the nearby soul evolvers and the armed troops stationed outside his village, he realized that no matter how many benefits he tried to use, this time he was truly alone. The soul evolvers and police officers who had been treated well by Kong Rong in the past lowered their heads in embarrassment when they met his anxious gaze. Although they were embarrassed, none of them dared to step forward. The benefits were good, sure. But one needed to live to enjoy such benefits, and unfortunately or not, no one could defeat the team of 3 young people in front of them. Even the strongest Shanli had been easily defeated. Seconds passed and soon those seconds turned into minutes. But Xietain still had not killed Shanli. He hadn't attacked him again either, he simply kept him firmly locked with several blood chains floating a dozen meters in the sky. No one knew what he was thinking, and those who believed he intended to torture or humiliate the arrogant Shanli began to doubt that these were his true intentions. Of course, the real reason why Xietain still allowed Shanli to continue breathing and living in this world was not so simple. Torture? Humiliate? He wasn't interested in wasting time right now. Approximately 5 minutes later, Shanli's mind finally cleared from the blow Xietain inflicted on him, which had caused him quite a bit of internal damage and had shocked his brain, leaving him blank for several minutes. Break! The arrogant and embarrassed Shanli shouted angrily. The mana inside his body began to boil fiercely, and he didn't hold back in the slightest as he once again activated gravity manipulation on the blood chains that held him prisoner. Cracks began to spread across the blood chains, threatening to break at any moment as the gravity weighing down on them pulled them back to solid ground. However, Xietain expended even more mana to keep them afloat. The only thing he did not do was reinforce the chains. Soon after, with no further support or supplies, the blood chains finally could not withstand the enormous gravity pressure on them and collapsed into small ruby-like fragments that fell from the sky. Xietain narrowed his eyes and manipulated the blood so that it lost its hardness, allowing it to return to its natural liquid state. The reason he did this was that while the small fragments of broken blood chains were seemingly harmless, falling from 12 meters high propelled by a gravity 28 times the Earth's natural gravity, those small fragments of blood chains were no longer so harmless. Oh. So that skill can also be used in this manner? Xietain muttered in a low voice that no one could hear as he looked up. A faint smile formed on his face as he watched Shanli's downward speed slow down considerably. You bastard! What the hell are you muttering? Shanli seemed to have gone mad. When his feet once again made contact with solid ground, he reactivated gravity manipulation as his bloodshot eyes stared at the young man in front of him without a shred of apparent rationality. Just as Shanli activated gravity manipulation, Xietain noticed it as he sensed the movement of mana from the surroundings. Therefore, while thinking that he was really getting used to this new source of power called mana, Xietain activated blood manipulation. Swoosh, swoosh, the surrounding blood flowed and gathered in front of him. The liquid hardened faster than the human eye could grasp and a sturdy blood wall formed in front of Xietain. Bang, rumble. The ground sank once again and the blood wall began to crack at a fast pace. However, Shanli's face did not show happiness. You bastard. Don't tell me you. Disbelief glittered in his eyes and he unconsciously stopped using his skill as he took a step back. Splash. Xietain stopped providing mana to the blood wall, which caused it to collapse into its liquid state once again. He looked at Shanli with a faint smile and calmly said, "Then your skill doesn't work unless you have within your range of vision the target you wish to affect. Also, it seems that the distance limit is around 15 meters. Am I wrong?" When he heard this, Shanli finally began to feel a twinge of fear. Because he realized, to his horror, that the young man in front of him was studying him. More precisely, he was studying his gravity manipulation skill. The thought of fleeing flashed in his mind and he was about to execute it when the calm and indifferent voice of his enemy stopped him in his tracks. "If I were you, I wouldn't move from where you are standing right now." Shanli felt something on his neck as he tried to take a step anteriorly. "Or your head might accidentally fall off," Xietain said with a smile as he narrowed his eyes. The wind whipped past the battlefield and the moonlight strangely reflected some objects that were extremely difficult to see with the naked eye, let alone in the middle of the night. Threads? Nangong Lingxin was taken aback. All over the battlefield, there were at least 100 silk-thin threads that had been placed in different parts. Each soul evolver had one of these crimson thin threads around their necks and the rest of the threads surrounded the armed troops, and even though the threads were fewer, they were placed in such a way that if someone had the ability to move them with the mind, these threads would cut horizontally across the waist of all the armed men and cut them in two. Shangguan Bingshui sighed and shook her head. She really had to admit that Xietain was simply too smart, and even when faced with people clearly weaker than him, he did not hesitate to prepare any countermeasures to ensure his own safety. Maybe he really can dominate all the country. For the first time, such a thought appeared in her mind and her eyes became a bit complex as she looked at his back. "Although I am not as good as I would like, these threads were created by me using the blood of the killed ones," Xietain calmly explained as one of the threads flew towards him and wrapped around his index finger. "In Japan, there is a moth called Eumeta japonica. This insect can produce an incredibly strong thread. These threads are based on that same insect. Only that its toughness was boosted by me to heights that even I cannot estimate at this point. You were doing all this in the middle of our fight? Li looked at him dumbfounded, finally realizing that the 20-year-old in front of him was more cunning than the old government foxes he had seen in the past. Xietain chuckled and said calmly, "It's just that you're too weak. That's why I had time to play around with my skill." He continued, "Your gravity manipulation skill not only allows you to affect a certain area or target within your line of sight within a certain range, but you can also apply it on yourself, right? I saw it while you were floating slowly from the sky earlier. Also, if I'm not mistaken, it's possible that since the gravity on you weakens a certain number of times, then your movement speed probably also becomes especially high, isn't it?" Li's face turned as pale as a sheet and he finally realized something. From the very beginning he had no hope to win. From the beginning of the battle, the young man in front of him was just studying his skill and never took him seriously. "Seeing your reaction, I guess I got it right." Xietain smiled slightly and waved his hand casually. "It was precisely for this theory that I prepared these threads. No matter where you run, you would run into at least one thread and I would only need to control it to cut you to pieces. Not bad, right?" The soul evolvers were so scared that they almost peed their pants as they looked at Xietain in terror. What kind of monster with human skin was this? Not only he was insanely strong, but he was also intelligent and seemed to be planning several steps ahead of his enemy. Why? Li was unwilling. Xietain thought for a moment before deciding to answer. "Nangonglingxin Xin told me about your skill before. From then on, I decided that your gravity manipulation skill would be my 5th external active skill. However, before killing you, I needed to know how the skill worked and its limits. After all, I can only learn a single more external skill for now, and the skill scroll probably won't explain in too much detail the use of the skill. I have to be cautious, don't you think? But this is enough. Your gravity manipulation skill will be my 5th and final active external skill." A couple of days ago, when Xietain killed Wang Zedong and Dai Yun, these two strangely dropped 2 skill scrolls that looked very much like their own active ones. Then, an idea popped into Xietan's mind, and while he didn't know what the specific skills of these 2 people were, he decided to ask Lilith about it. The question he asked her at that time was, if a human evolves a skill from 1st order to 2nd order and, by fate, is killed by another human, is it possible that they would always drop a skill scroll of the weakened version of the evolved skill? Lilith's answer at that time left him incredibly satisfied. Li sighed and shook his head, causing the thin thread clinging to his neck to tighten and blood began to flow out. He seemed oblivious to this and looked at Kong Rong, who was kneeling on the ground, looking like someone defeated by life. "Chief Kong, I'm sorry. But as you can see, this enemy is beyond my current capability." Kong Rong did not reply. He just looked at the ground as if he was stunned, like a lifeless ghost. Seeing this, Li sighed again before looking at Xietain with a sincere expression. "Chief Kang's forces will probably fall into your hands tonight. I won't ask you to let me live, but I hope you can let my family go." Xietain narrowed his eyes and the smile on his face turned slightly cold as he said, "When you send assassins to kill people just for your insecurity, do you care about the family of these victims? Today, if it wasn't for my group having the strength to protect ourselves, an innocent 10-year-old girl could have died because of your selfishness. Do you think you have the right to ask for anything?" Swoosh. 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 With a single thought, blood threads flew through the sky and several dozen of them surrounded Li's body. Ugh. Li's face contorted slightly as blood began to pour out all over his body as the blood threads were too thin and hard, so his skin and flesh were being cut at the contact. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 264, Gravity Manipulation. After the skill Blood Manipulation evolved into 2nd order, the formerly deep red rune became slightly lighter and gained some mysterious engravings. This rune, like all learned skills regardless of whether it was passive or active, represented what a skill could do, and the information on how to use that skill was imprinted in the user's soul, allowing an existence to make use of that skill as if they had been training for a lifetime. The power of blood manipulation grew to twice the previous, and Xietain also acquired a lot of information, which caused the number and variations of attacks he could make using the skill to increase explosively. After acquiring a lot of knowledge, his control over the blood manipulation skill was significantly higher than in the past. Therefore, it was relatively simple for Xietain to establish a safe perimeter. Swoosh. Swoosh. As the blood threads surrounding Xietain tightened, blood wounds opened up on every inch of his skin, and the clothes covering him began to slowly shred into pieces. Ugh. Ack. Xietain tried to endure the pain, but after a couple of seconds, the pain of being cut into hundreds of pieces while he was still conscious was too much for anyone to bear silently. Xietain showed no mercy. Surely you have committed many atrocities after gaining power. So I shall give you a death full of pain and regret. He declared as he held the thread around Xiaolin's neck taut enough to hurt him but not enough to decapitate him. Kill me. Kill me if you dare. Xiaolin could no longer resist such torture, and all he desired was death. His skin was cut, his flesh ripped apart, and his muscles torn into thin pieces. The tendons in his body broke as the blood threads dug into his body, and blood began to stain the courtyard floor. You will die. You will definitely die. Xietain nodded and focused his full attention, taking great care as he made the blood threads advance at millimeter speed. However, you have to suffer first. You are not worthy of a quick death. F. Who are you to judge? Damn, it hurts. Do you think you are God? Amidst cries filled with heart-rending wailing, Xiaolin looked at Xietain with bloodshot eyes. At this point, he could no longer be considered a human as his body was completely dyed red. Flesh and blood were falling to the floor non-stop, and his limbs were about to fall to the spot on the grass along with his waist practically cut into pieces. The pain Xiaolin was experiencing was so great that he had passed out several times in the process before waking up again due to the pain. No, I am not God. Xietain shook his head and said calmly, but I am stronger than you. Just as you decided who lived and who died before, now that someone stronger than you appeared, then naturally you should be prepared for that someone, namely me, to decide on your fate. Xiaolin could not reply. He could only scream until his voice became hoarse and until his vocal strings practically broke. Xiaolin's cries, filled with anguish, sounded like the wails of a ghost in gloom. The silence of the night was broken, and all those who lived in the vicinity of Kong Rong's villa despaired in their own villas without daring to go out. Too cruel. Nangong Lingxin could no longer look at Xiaolin's miserable appearance anymore. She was a normal woman, after all. She didn't have a skill that made her practically immune to emotions like pity and sympathy towards others, just in the same way as Xietain. Unfortunately, although she could decide what to see and what not to see, the piercing screams of the man being cut to pieces was not something she could stop. Even after covering her ears, she could not stop the pain-filled voice from reaching her. Shangguan Bingshui tolerated it for a few seconds. However, it soon became intolerable even for her. Unable to bear to see any more, she also turned her face away, and as she listened to the thunderous screams, her blue eyes flashed with a complicated light. After a few more seconds, Xiaolin's 4 limbs had fallen off his body and fell helplessly to the floor. His torso was practically torn apart and his internal organs fell to the earth one after another. The current him could no longer be considered a human anymore. Even if Xietain left him like this, he would definitely die soon, and the only reason he was still breathing was because he was a rather powerful soul evolver. No more screaming. Xietain muttered as he looked at the man in front of him with cold eyes. He had his own reasons for being this cruel to Xiaolin. When they entered the courtyard, Xietain noticed how Xiaolin looked at Shangguan Bingshui and Nangong Lingxin with greed and naked desire. Such a man who looked at women as if they were objects definitely wasn't a good bird, and Xietain had no doubt that he had abused the survivors of the base to satisfy his own vanity and lust. From his personal point of view, a person who took the lives of the innocent without a second thought and used those of the opposite sex as a toy did not deserve any mercy. Xietain could be wrong, maybe his way of acting was not the right way, he was aware of this. But if I am wrong, if my actions are wrong, then I am willing to suffer the consequences if someone stronger than me appears someday. He muttered under his breath, talking to himself as if to affirm his own thoughts. After this, Zemin looked at Shanli, who had a blank look and didn't seem to be able to feel the pain, and said loudly, "Shanli, don't worry. I will take care of your family personally." Shanli, who seemed to have lost consciousness after feeling his body being cut into hundreds of pieces, suddenly gained self-consciousness again after hearing what Zemin said. His eyes were filled with fury and he seemed to be about to say something, but Zemin had no intention of listening to his empty threats or useless curses. Zemin tightened his grip on the end of the blood thread in his hand and pulled it roughly. The blood thread, which was wrapped around Shanli's neck, immediately tightened and the thin cord cut the throat and then the rest of the man's neck without any difficulty, as if it were a pair of sharp scissors cutting white paper. Critical hit. You have received the soul power of First Order Shanli level 35. You have received magic plus 19, mana plus 10. Shanli's head made a thud as it hit the ground and rolled over twice before it stopped. The expression on his face, filled with fury, fear, and grief, had been immortalized forever as his life was lost in that instant. Zemin walked slowly forward as the others looked at him with lingering fear and respect. No one dared to make the slightest sound. After reaching Shanli's practically torn corpse, Zemin seemed oblivious to the mess of blood and flesh as he crouched down. I see. Then that's the why I felt this part was harder to get through. Zemin lighted up as he looked at the leather armor covering the torso of the corpse before him. This leather armor was made from the leather of a first-order beast, but its durability had fallen to critical levels after being tortured by Zemin's blood threads. After all, Zemin's blood creations were 20% more powerful than his other attacks thanks to his unique job Blood Berserker. Ignoring the armor that was definitely not worth the effort of repairing, he picked up some pieces of equipment belonging to the Soul Record System and temporarily stored them in his waist pouch for inspection later. Only one item remained in his hands, a scroll. Gravity Manipulation, First Order Active Skill, Level 5. By learning this skill, the user gains the ability to control gravity 10 meters around. The increase or decrease of gravitational force is based on the laws of the world where the user is and the user's mana and magic, where 10 mana and 10 magic are the equivalents of increasing or decreasing gravity x1. The current limit is 15 times gravity. It consumes 5 mana points to activate and 1 mana point every 10 seconds to maintain the skill. The information on the scroll containing the skill Gravity Manipulation was quite similar to what Zemin expected to find. Basically, the effect and its range as well as the amount of consumption and how it worked. However, that was all. Fortunately, Zemin already had a good foundation on how to use the gravity manipulation skill thanks to spending time studying Shanli and analyzing the details and uses that the scroll did not state by default. Furthermore, another thing that left Zemin incredibly satisfied was the fact that the gravity manipulation skill was not exclusively tied to planet Earth. If this was the case, then he might have to give up learning this active skill since while it was powerful, with such a limitation its future would not be good. Zemin tightened his grip on the earth-colored scroll in his right hand and it burst into particles of brown light that were soon absorbed into his body. You have learned the external active skill, First Order Gravity Manipulation Level 5. You have learned 5 external active skills. You cannot learn any more external active skills before reaching Second Order. Second Order, huh? He muttered in a sigh as he slowly stood up. He was currently level 45, and ever since he defeated the Second Order Archaic Bear, his level did not go up. While his soul power was purer and bigger since he had defeated and killed many enemies, the amount of soul power gained was not enough to push him to the next level. Still, while he had spent 1 week locked up in his workshop forging equipment and his level had not increased, Zemin's strength had increased a lot. In fact, even he didn't know how strong he was now. I didn't even have to unsheath the blazing scale greatsword. Zemin reached back and stroked the handle of his weapon, which still rested sealed inside its scabbard. His instinct told him that it was better not to test the power of this weapon here, so in the end, he decided it was better not to do it. He would have plenty of chances in the future anyway, there was no hurry. Zemin turned his body and looked at all the people present coldly. Those who were more timid took a couple of steps back as they shuddered in fear. But such a reaction was natural, considering everything they had just witnessed, and Zemin did not mind. He waved his hand casually and activated blood manipulation once again. Swoosh. 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 The blood on the battlefield trembled and under his command moved in his direction, swiftly gathering under his feet. In the next instant, the blood rose into the sky, taking the shape of a small stage over 10 meters high. Xietain again waved his hand in the wind, and from the blood stage several blood chains flew towards the floor at full speed. Before anyone could react, the blood chains surrounded Kong Rong's body and lifted him into the air, leaving him suspended in midair a short distance away from Xietain. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 265, Taking Control. After being carelessly lifted into the sky as if he were a piece of garbage, Kong Rong wanted to explode in a fit of rage. However, that fit of rage never came, as when he realized that he was 10 meters above the ground, the fear in his heart grew to levels never seen before. The formerly all-powerful Kong Rong, who held in his hands the power to decide who lived or who died, who controlled over 200 armed men, and with several dozen soul evolvers listening to him, now used his 2 fat hands to cling for his life onto the blood chains. For the current Kong Rong, these blood chains that were supposed to imprison him were his life insurance. After all, if he fell from a height of 10 meters, it would definitely be no different than saying goodbye to his little life. Kong Rong's armed troops, who were not yet present, also arrived at the scene to witness such an act. Those who were confused to see the large gathering of people dressed as police officers asked what was going on, and when they finally learned of the situation, all of them were speechless. Since the first shot and the warning that someone was attacking the premium area of the base had gone out, it had only been a couple of minutes at most. These gunmen could not believe that the defense could not even hold out for 20 minutes before collapsing. However, seeing that most of the gunmen did not dare to charge, and even the usually proud and arrogant soul evolvers now looked like obedient little lambs, no one dared to cause a stir. All they could do was look at the 20-year-old young man standing on the blood-red stage, looking down as if he was the king of heaven. Xietain looked at the hundreds of people outside the villa yard and spoke coldly, "My name is Xietain. As you can see, the person next to me is your former leader, Kong Rong. I am currently the leader of a survivor base with over 2,000 members south of this camp. Several days ago, a family came to my camp for protection after being chased with malicious intentions by a good-for-nothing dog named Kong Hong. It was then when I learned of the atrocities that were going on in this place." He paused for a moment as several people could not help but begin to murmur. The surprise in the voice of these armed men and soul evolvers could be imagined when they learned that he, a young man who had not yet finished his studies, was currently the leader of such a big camp. You should know that the North Camp currently had around 3,000 survivors, but these 3,000 survivors were not ruled by a single power, since at the base there was not only Kong Rong, there was also a Li Yuan with by no means inferior power. This was completely different from Xietain, who had just declared that he ruled over 2,000 lives. Of course, although many had their doubts whether what he said was true or not, no one dared to voice it out loud, and temporarily they could only remain with doubt in their hearts. From this moment onwards, I will be taking over the forces previously controlled by Kong Rong. Nonsense. What thing are you? Just as Xietain continued his explanation of the situation, a young man who was about the same age as him seemed to have been holding back for a while when he finally couldn't take it anymore and finally burst out with a furious roar. Xietain looked at him, causing that young man to flinch. However, with a Type 79 assault rifle in his hands, this young man seemed to gain confidence and continued, "Boss Kong gave us these weapons, gave us safety, and gave us hope. You're just a kid who gained some strength and wants to take charge? Do you think things will be done just because you want them to be done? Brothers, join me in rescuing Boss Kong." The young man raised his rifle high, expecting his companions to follow him. Unfortunately, this young man overestimated too much what a firearm could do to a powerful soul evolver. Those more experienced in these matters simply gave him a look of sympathy, while those who hesitated finally decided not to move as they saw the veteran standing without making a sound. Even the desperate Kong Rong had no expectation in his eyes as he looked at everything with a stunned look. The hot-blooded youth was dumbfounded. He believed that they would definitely follow him. After all, saving one of the most powerful bosses in the entire base would result in immediate great promotion, honor, glory, resources, beautiful women, and they might even receive some skill scroll or some treasure. But what this young man didn't know was that he first needed his life to be able to enjoy these benefits. Swoosh! Zemin pointed, and a kind of extremely long spear-shaped tentacle shot out from the middle of the blood stage. Before this young man could say anything else, the blood tentacle pierced his brain, pierced through his head, and pierced past the paved street, causing a small bang before retracting once more and returning to the blood stage as if nothing had happened. Thud. The lifeless body fell to the ground, making a thud and raising some dust in the process. Blood and skull fragments stained the ground as the young man's eyes remained wide open, staring up at the night sky, but lifeless to appreciate its beauty. All those who were closest moved away from the corpse in haste, and those who were more fearful even fainted on the spot. At that moment, Zemin's indifferent and cold voice sounded again, "If any of you do not want to follow me, then leave your firearm on the ground and retreat. Of course, those of you who decide to leave will lose all your privileges, and will have to live the way I want you to live or do other kinds of menial jobs to make a living." This time no one said anything. Nor did anyone express an opinion about leaving after some hesitation. Even the men who previously worked alongside Kong Rong before the apocalypse were not willing to lose their privileges and the good life they currently had. For these people, as long as there were benefits, it did not matter to them whether they had to obey a young man or an old man. Zemin nodded in satisfaction and continued, speaking calmly, "Those of you, officers with firearms, who are leaders of your respective teams or squads, step forward." A few seconds later, 15 people stepped forward and stood before Zemin. These 15 had about 10 armed men under their command. "Very well. I want 10 teams to return to the walls and take charge of securing the perimeter to prevent a zombie or wild beast from sneaking in. On the other hand, the other 5 teams should patrol the streets of the base and make sure there are no troublemakers. If you find any, simply execute them on the spot. After the 5 teams in charge of maintaining order finish this task, they can rest for 4 hours, then they must go to the walls and switch with 5 different teams. As for the other team of 5, you can take over 4 hours later with one of the teams on standby." Zemin didn't know if there was chaos in the base at the moment. After all, there had been several gunshots and even an explosion during tonight's raid. While the privileged area was quite far away from the rest of the base, he couldn't be sure that sounds wouldn't reach far away due to how quiet the night was. All those soul evolvers who previously protected this village should also support the armed troops to secure the perimeter. "You need not worry about my safety, nor do you need to worry about Li Yuan, as I will personally take care of this matter tomorrow itself. However, before you leave, I want you to remove these corpses from here." Zemin finished indifferently. The reason he specifically chose soul evolvers was because these people, in order to evolve, had to have killed at least one zombie in melee unless they had real proficiency with firearms control. Therefore, they were less likely to be frightened by the corpse of the dead. The 200 or so men saluted, and after giving Kong Rong one last look, they departed. Some of them got into different types of transport vehicles, mainly trucks capable of carrying a dozen men at a time, and left in different directions. Seeing everyone leaving, Zemin sighed and waved his hand. The blood stage began to slowly shrink until it finally reached the ground and became a red carpet. He stepped out of the blood carpet, and soon after the latter turned back into pure, liquid blood that began to be absorbed into the surrounding grass and ground. "Good job." Nangong Lingxin and Shangguan Bingshui approached in his direction. Zemin watched as a group of people moved the bodies into large bags or used mats to wrap them up, and shook his head as he said quietly, "There is still a lot of work to be done. Because it's so late, I can only do so much for today." "Indeed." Shangguan Bingshui nodded. Things were not as simple as saying, "Now I am the boss, then go and work as I order you." It was necessary to go around the base, talk to the different team leaders to better understand the situation, check the current armament and amount of ammunition, check the number of supplies to make calculations, and know approximately how long it would last based on the consumption needed, make a count of how many survivors were in the base and how many of them were workers, know what things needed to be improved, and so on. The amount of work was too much to list in full. However, Zemin had no trusted people here except the team he arrived with. Besides, it was already late at night, so it was not convenient to move around either. Therefore, he and his team could only wait for a team from Beginning Village to arrive before starting to work in a big way. The interior of Kong Rong's villa was truly luxurious, just as Zemin expected when he saw its exterior. It had several well-appointed rooms with comfortable twin beds, crystal chandeliers above the ceiling with various lights set to match the natural environment, soft forest wood pattern tiles, soft and fluffy to the touch carpets in the hallways, paintings whose value before the apocalypse ranged from tens of thousands of yuan to hundreds of thousands, etc. As two beautiful maidens showed off the villa, they occasionally looked back cautiously. However, there was no fear in their eyes, and mostly it was pure curiosity for their new boss after Kong Rong was dethroned. Still wearing his deep black armor and with his greatsword on his back, the barely 20-year-old Bai Zemin looked truly brave and powerful. Despite the battle he had fought earlier, his body did not even have a drop of blood on it, and from the vigorous light in his eyes, one could deduce that he was not even exhausted in the slightest, which suggested that he had also not exerted himself to bring down one of the base's tightest defenses. These two beautiful maidens worked for Kong Rong in the past, and like the rest of their companions, they were curious about this indifferent-looking young man. After all, they were aware that their fates were practically tied to this person, since he would be the one to decide their paths from now on. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 266, Shy Maid in the Bathroom. As they walked through the corridors of the huge villa, Yifeng felt that she was living in a dream from which she would prefer not to wake up if possible. If everything she was seeing and everything that was happening before her eyes at this moment was nothing more than a fantasy produced by her own despair, then she was willing to lose herself in this warm world rather than return to the cold and cruel reality. Luxurious corridors, beautiful and respectful maidens, vases made of ceramics whose egocentric designs attracted the eye, paintings sparkling with life. For Yifeng, who came from an ordinary family before the arrival of a soul record on Earth and whose life became a living hell after her husband passed away, leaving her alone with her young daughter and without any power to protect them both, everything that was happening here was beyond what she could have ever expected. Unconsciously, the single mother looked at the two people walking in the front, following closely behind the two beautiful young maidens dressed in elegant French uniforms, and gratitude filled her tear-filled eyes. "Mom, why are you crying? Are you sad?" "Mom is crying out of happiness, Feng." Yifeng hugged her daughter's small body tightly in her arms. For the first time, her fluttering heart was able to receive some warmth, and she began to calm down to think about the future. Future. A foreign word to her. She, who didn't know if she could survive another minute and who was trying her best for the today, the word future, the tomorrow, was nothing but a luxury. For Yifeng, who already had her hands occupied with the present, tomorrow was too distant to think about. But now she could finally breathe. All thanks to the fact that life had put the two young people in front of her in her hopeless path. Innocent about her mother's thoughts, little Xiang Feng curled up like a kitten in her embrace and murmured, "Mummy, I'm sleepy." The little girl was not worried about the luxurious place. At this point, what she longed for most was a warm bed and a soft pillow on which to rest comfortably. Bai Zemin looked behind him over his shoulder and instructed one of the maids, "One of you guide the two ladies to a room on the second floor." After taking over Kong Rong's villa and suppressing his forces, Bai Zemin locked him in the cellar temporarily while Nangong Lingxin and Shangguan Bingshui headed west of the base to search for the mother and daughter duo, Nangong Yi and Evangeline. Because Xiang Feng was comfortably asleep after spending cold days in a broken wooden hut without even a proper bed, she slept with delight until she was awakened by her mother to the little girl's disappointment. It was only after she learned that they were moving to a nicer house that the little girl's curiosity overcame her anger and she agreed. However, she finally could not beat the sleep. After all, at the age of 10, Xiang Feng was in the middle of growing up, and at her age children needed a lot of sleep to replenish the energy their bodies consumed during the growing process. A pretty maiden of about 29 years old stopped and bowed respectfully before approaching the mother and daughter duo. "Madam, please this way." Yifeng was not used to being treated this way, so she said nothing and nodded slightly with a complicated look. Before leaving, she looked at Bai Zemin and asked cautiously, "As for us?" Bai Zemin looked at her and said calmly, "You can start working as my maid from tomorrow. Of course, if you are not satisfied, you can look for a job in a few days when everything is properly settled." Hearing this, Yifeng let out a sigh of relief and said with a smile, "I am willing to work for you, young Bai. Thank you very much for all you have done for me and my daughter." Bai Zemin waved his hand and said nothing more. The reason he helped was because he really couldn't handle the pain-filled look in Xiang Feng's innocent eyes, and that was it. Now it was Yifang's turn to start working. After all, Bai Zemin was not interested in keeping a woman he had no particular feelings for. Soon, Yifang left with her sleeping daughter in her arms under the guidance of the beautiful maiden. As they walked down the corridor on the second floor, Evangeline sighed, "You've really did it, and in such a short time." Before she had seen Shan Li's head, so there was no doubt that it was all real. Bai Zemin, Shangguan Bing Shui, and Nangong Lingxin had left under the veil of night to launch an offensive against Kong Rong. 30 minutes after they left, the two women returned to tell them that it was all over and that they should move east of the base. Well, they were all weak. Bai Zemin replied calmly. That man named Shan Li was a bit strong, but I have a skill that practically allows me to overwhelm any human being or intelligent creature. Not to mention that his stats were far below mine. Shangguan Bing Shui shrugged her shoulders. In fact, it had all been quite easy from her point of view. She hadn't even consumed 1/10 of her total mana, as she had finished everything in a few seconds with several swings of her frozen winter sword. The maiden leading the way ahead could feel her lips involuntarily twitch a couple of times as she listened to the conversation behind her. The surprise in her heart increased once again. When Bai Zemin's group, which consisted of 5 people including him but leaving out the maiden, reached the end of the corridor, they were greeted by a lineup of 10 beautiful maidens. All of them had their unique charms, but without a doubt they could all be considered the flower of the harvest even before the world changed, not to mention now that beautiful women were a rarity because due to poor nutrition, 99% of them were starting to have malnutrition problems, and their previously white and smooth skins started to turn a bit yellow and dry. This Kong guy sure knew how to live life. Nangong Yi sighed as he watched this. Although he was 40 years old, as a soul evolver near level 25, he was still vigorous as a young adult before the apocalypse. Therefore, it was impossible for his heart not to sting a little when he saw so many beautiful women. Shangguan Bing Shui glanced sideways at him and her blue eyes flashed with a hint of coldness, sending a chill down the spine of Nangong Yi, who hurriedly coughed and looked away. Bai Zemin chuckled at this but did not comment on it. Everyone knew that Shangguan Bing Shui did not tolerate men very much, and any impertinent comment was enough to agitate her. In fact, except for Chen, he who already knew what he may and may not say, and Bai Zemin himself who had fought alongside her in countless battles, gaining a certain level of comfort with her, no man could chat with the Ice Princess for more than a few words before fleeing in the face of her coldness. The maid who was leading the way stepped forward and said respectfully, "Sirs, ladies, this is the main bath of the villa. In addition to this one, which has a large pool, there is also a bath on the upper floors. However, the size of these is roughly half the size of this one and their facilities may not be as luxurious in comparison. I don't know if you." After a battle, it was natural for warriors to want to enjoy a comforting hot bath. This had been the case since ancient times and had not changed in the present day. The reason this maiden said such words was because she did not know whether they, 2 men and 3 women, wanted to shower all together or not. "Someone take me to the bathroom on the top floor," Shangguan Bing Shui unconsciously ordered coldly. She naturally understood the maid's question. The maid shuddered briefly before nodding hurriedly. She seemed to have a certain prestige among the maidens as they all seemed to listen to her. As to whether this was because her age was quite mature or not, Bai Zemin did not know. "Rua Lan, take the ladies to the 3rd floor and show them the location of the bath," the maid instructed. "Make sure everything is in order and that everything is of comfort to the ladies." The woman named Rua Lan stepped forward and bowed respectfully before gesturing for Shangguan Bing Shui, Nangong Lingxin, and Evangeline to follow her. "Don't have too much fun." Nangong Lingxin chuckled and followed in the footsteps of the maid named Rua Lan. Before leaving she even winked at them as if she understood something. Evangeline did not say a single word. Her expression was cold and her jade-green eyes attentive to the surroundings as she followed the maiden. Shangguan Bing Shui, on the other hand, paused for a moment. She glanced at the lineup of beautiful maidens before her gaze fell on the bodies of Bai Zemin and Nangong Yi. She coldly snorted and walked away, leaving behind her personal scent similar to that of a young wild jasmine. Bai Zemin forced a smile and was quite speechless as he said, "Apparently, this woman assumed things on her own." "Huh?" Nangongyi looked at him dumbfounded and said in confusion, "We're not having fun then?" This time it was Bai Zemin's turn to look at him dumbfounded. After a moment, he put on a serious expression and said in a deep voice, "Let me tell you something. If you want to sleep with a woman, it will have to be by mutual agreement, or else you know the consequences. Besides, if you want to sleep with the women who will be working in my house, you had better be prepared to take care of them." Nangongyi's expression froze for a moment before he said, "I say, Bai Zemin, do you think I'm a perverted old man or something? Although I do have my needs like any normal man, I have never in my life forced myself on any woman, nor do I plan to do so. Much less knowing that my head will roll on the floor moments later. Besides, all the women I sleep with are about my age and none of them are even close to my sister's age. What kind of person do you think I am, as long as you understand?" Bai Zemin nodded in satisfaction. The maidens who were quietly listening to the conversation finally realized who the person with real power in this group was. Moreover, many of them let out sighs of relief unconsciously, since apparently the young man in front of them did not seem to be someone evil or twisted-minded. Soon, the two large wooden doors opened wide and the sight of the bathroom entered Bai Zemin's eyes. The bathroom was entirely made out of marble. Its interior was clean and bright. In the center was a huge pool 10 m in diameter, and in the middle of the pool was an artificial rock formation from which hot water was pouring out. Steam rose between the walls and the scent of fruity soap seemed to find its release when the doors opened. Bai Zemin carefully grabbed his sword and put it down on the ground. This thing weighed around 1 ton, about the weight of a lot of normal vehicles, and if it fell abruptly the marble floor would definitely be destroyed. Soon, two beautiful maidens approached him and looked at him with shy eyes. One of them, about 21 or 22 years old, said in a whisper, "Sir, let us help you undress." Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 267 An Encounter by Coincidence. Bai Zemin took a moment to carefully observe the woman in front of him. Her slightly brown hair fell softly over her shoulders and due to the steam released by the hot water inside the pool was slightly steamy. Her brown eyes shone with a hint of shyness, but there was not even a hint of fear or unwillingness in them. Her body did not exude a charm that urged men to immediate lust like Lilith, but instead seemed to ask to be cherished with care and delicacy. Overall, she was a very pretty girl even if she was not a great beauty. Bai Zemin believed that she could easily be among the top 20 most beautiful women at Beijing University in the past, and considering that the girl before him was 1 to 3 years older than him, perhaps she was still a student before the world change. "Do you know how to remove this kind of gear?" Bai Zemin asked with a smile as he pointed to himself. The girl stared dumbfounded, looking at the black armor covering his body, and for a moment she was speechless. Forget about removing this kind of clothing, she hadn't even seen real leather armor in her entire life. And no. The young girl lowered her head shyly and shook her head softly. Seeing the young girl in front of him acting like this, Bai Zemin couldn't help but be slightly amused. As easy as it may have been in reality, a battle was still a battle, therefore, a slight momentary change wouldn't hurt anyone either. "Okay. Help me with this. I'll guide you." Bai Zemin finally relented. The young girl's eyes lit up and she nodded several times like a little chick pecking at rice. She moved her hands timidly and Bai Zemin's voice guided her movements. Occasionally, he would grab her arms gently and move her hands in the right direction as he tried to coordinate with her awkward movements. "What is your name?" he asked casually as staying silent could become uncomfortable for everyone. "My name is Fu Shuren." The young woman responded as a bead of sweat slid down her face. It was unclear if it was from the heat inside the bath or if it was from her nerves. "I see." Bai Zemin nodded calmly and looked at Nangongyi out of the corner of his eye. The man was also receiving the same treatment as him by another maiden of about 39 years old with a particularly seductive body. Unlike Nangongyi, who might be interested in sleeping with any woman to satisfy his lust and to relieve the stress of not knowing if he would still be alive the next day, Bai Zemin had no thought of doing anything with Fu Shuren. But even if he wished to do so, he could have a peaceful conscience since he had no need to explain himself to anyone. After all, leaving aside the factor that he was the leader of an expanding and powerful faction, he was a single man. Besides, who said that one had to have a sentimental relationship with a woman to have a carnal relationship? It was very normal nowadays to have a night of fun and the next day act as if nothing had happened. Although this kind of behavior was not something that Xietain himself appreciated too much. After withdrawing his gaze, Xietain tried to continue chatting until the work was finished. Were you a student before the apocalypse? Or maybe you were working? Perhaps feeling calmer hearing the unpressured voice and friendly attitude of the person she was helping, Fu Shuren was no longer so nervous, and after a few minutes of effort, finally managed to remove several locks from the armor. She explained, I was a student. However, my grades were not particularly outstanding, just average. Therefore, I could not get into Beijing University and could only settle for a second-rate one in the same district. Xietain chuckled, and as he withdrew his arms from the chest plate, he consoled, well, you needn't worry too much about that. Even if we put aside that at the end of the day it was no use going to a prestigious university, considering the current state of the world, the reality is that Beijing University is no big deal at all either. Except for the ease with which its graduates can get a job due to its worldwide prestige, it's nothing out of this world. Fu Shuren subconsciously smiled. She gently shook her head and said softly, the reason I feel a little bitter is not because of the honor I would receive after graduating, it's just that my younger brother managed to get into Beijing University. As the big sister, I can't help but feel like a bit of a failure. Fu Shuren's voice practically mingled with the sound of the water that the artificial formation in the center of the pool was constantly releasing and contained a bit of pain as well as a bit of regret. However, a thought flashed in Xiein's mind and his expression froze for a second. He looked again at the young woman in front of him, but this time was as if he wanted to study her very DNA. Don't tell me, you. What did you say your name was? He asked hesitantly. Huh? The young woman naturally felt the change of the person in front of her, and as she took off the upper part of the armor as well as the t-shirt, she replied confusedly, my name is Fu Shuren. Then, her voice trailed off as she looked at the naked torso of the young man in front of her, and her brown eyes were briefly dazed on his figure. His skin was delicate but not similar to a woman's, but filled with masculine charm with a roughness that only men possess. His chest looked extremely firm and his abs looked like they had been sculpted by the gods themselves. Like any normal person who visited the ocean during the summer to take a dip in the cold water, Fu Shuren had naturally seen the naked upper parts of countless men, and among them were several with truly stunning bodies. However, in front of the body of the young man before her, all those men paled to the point that it would be difficult to look at them again. Unfortunately, Xietain no longer had any intentions of playing or having fun chatting with this young miss, and therefore also didn't seem to notice how she was looking at him in a daze. By any chance? Your younger brother's name is Fu Xietain? Xietain asked a little tensely. In China, it was not at all uncommon for many people to have the same surname, despite not being related in any way. Xietain himself had known at least a dozen people with his surname even though they were not related by blood. However, the case of the woman in front of him was different. Her surname was Fu, and she had a younger brother who had been admitted to Beijing University. Considering that Fu Shuren was only a few years older than him, Xietain could naturally conclude that her younger brother had to be about the same age as him. Fu Shuren's eyes flinched when she heard Xiein's question. She seemed to snap out of her trance and looked at him with fearful, hopeful eyes, and many more complicated emotions as she hurriedly said, That's right. My younger brother's name is Fu Xietain. He's 19 this year and he's also wearing a pair of glasses for eyesight. You. My brother. The corner of Xietan's mouth twitched a couple of times as he finally confirmed his theory. What kind of demon curse was this? Just when he wanted to tease a pretty woman, it turned out that she was the older sister of one of his trusted men. Xietain couldn't help but slap his face as he sighed. However, he soon calmed down. Fortunately, only his upper body had been exposed, or it might have been awkward to talk to Fu Xietain in the future. Your younger brother is alive. He is also currently living a good life. Xietain said in a serious voice. There was no more amused tone or anything in his voice. He is 2 days away from this place in the southern direction, and is a powerful soul evolver under my rule. This was also good. He did not expect to meet by chance a direct relative of one of his subordinates right in this place. Fu Shuren's eyes filled with tears upon hearing Xiein's words, and she brought both hands to cover her mouth as she took a step back. The joy in her heart as well as the relief of knowing that she was not alone in this cruel world was such that it burned like a volcano inside her. In the end, the only thing she could do was to bow down and thank him in tears. "Thank you. Thank you." Although she didn't know how things turned out, Fu Shuren knew that her younger brother somehow must have received the favor from the person in front of her, since from her point of view there was no way the thin and timid Fu Xietain would dare to fight without support from someone. Little did she know that while her theory was true, it was also not completely accurate, since although Fu Shufeng indeed received support from Bai Zemin and he even gave him his Xianyuan sword to kill the first zombie and then gave him the skill scroll that fell from the kill, Fu Xiefeng was the second person to stand up among hundreds of students only behind Kai Jingyi. Bai Zemin smiled slightly and waved his hand as he calmly said, "Don't worry. Your younger brother has also been helping me and will continue to do so in the future, for which you don't need to say thank you to me." Fu Shuren, still emotionally moved, wiped away her tears and nodded even though gratitude was still in her eyes. Suddenly, Bai Zemin thought of something and asked with a deep voice, "Did that Kongrong pig do something to you? Did someone on this base touch you?" Fu Shuren was surprised by the sudden change. However, she soon understood and hurriedly shook her head. "I only arrived at the base 3 days ago, and just started working here this afternoon. No one has done anything mean to me." Bai Zemin sighed in his heart. This girl was very lucky that he and his group showed up here just today, or it would be hard to say what would happen to her. "I see." He nodded and ordered, "Dismissed. You can join your brother in a couple of days. In the meantime, there is no need for you to work as a maidservant." As one of the main soul evolvers under his rule, Fu Xiefeng naturally received a large amount of resources as payment, and his lifestyle could be considered luxurious in the apocalypse. Bai Zemin did not know if Fu Xiefeng wanted his sister to work as someone else's maidservant, so it was better to wait and see. However, who knew Fu Shuren would refuse? She shook her head hurriedly and took a step forward as she stretched out both hands with the intention of wanting to continue with her task, and no need. I can still dash. All right, that's enough. Bai Zemin easily sidestepped her and sternly ordered, "It's not a question. It is an order. When your younger brother is here, you can talk with him and then decide what to do." Fu Xiefeng was one of his 10 most powerful soul evolvers, and Bai Zemin had no intention of letting a crack grow in the middle of the trust that was growing between the two of them because of such nonsense like this. Fu Shuren cowered and pulled back her hands as she saw the serious expression on the face of the young man in front of her. The calm and seemingly friendly expression was nowhere to be found, and all that remained now was pure indifference. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 268, Unusual Dream. Bai Zemin ignored Fu Shuren's reaction and instead suddenly began to worry about something else. He approached up to the mature maiden who had helped Nangongyi take care of his clothes and asked in a firm voice, "What is your name? How old are you?" The maiden was startled for a moment when she saw him walking towards her. However, upon hearing his question, she hurriedly responded in a respectful voice, "Sir, my name is Chu Jiao, and I will be 40 this year." Phew. Bai Zemin let out a sigh of relief. Fortunately, she wasn't someone's mother or something like that. "All right, you two go ahead and retire. You don't need to do anything else for now." Chu Jiao bowed and retreated along with Fu Shuren, who gave one last glance at Bai Zemin before closing the double doors to the bathroom. Bloody hell. Bai Zemin was speechless as he took off the lower part of the armor. Really? If what happened before wasn't a coincidence, then there simply shouldn't be any coincidence in this world. Who would have thought that he would meet the sister of an ally? Fortunately, and Bai Zemin was a fairly rational and upright person. Otherwise, if he was a young man who got carried away by the heat of the moment and jumped on the beautiful Fu Shuren, he probably might have had to take charge for his entire life, or worse, lose an ally. After all, even if Fu Xiefeng did not say anything, his heart would definitely not be happy. After taking off his armor completely as well as the light clothing he wore underneath, Bai Zemin took a white towel and wrapped it around his waist before walking towards the pool in the center of the bath. The steam had built up so much that while the view was not obstructed to the point of not seeing, it did make it difficult to see with clarity what was going on several meters ahead. When Xietain finally descended the steps of the pool, the hot water began to slowly rise from the tips of his toes, his legs, thighs, and only when the lower half was almost completely covered did he stop and lean back against an edge. A sigh of satisfaction escaped automatically from his mouth and his eyes closed involuntarily. All the muscles in his body immediately began to loosen as he came into contact with the warm water and his pores opened to breathe in the clean surrounding air. Although Xietain could always enjoy similar treatments, this case was special and his body was particularly tense with his mind on constant guard. After all, this was the base of an enemy faction, and even though he was strong, he could still be killed if he had a moment's carelessness. Man, who would have thought that kid's sister would be here? A low but deep voice sounded a few feet away. Xietain softly opened his eyes, and even though his gaze was directed at the white ceiling, he naturally knew that the voice belonged to the one person who was accompanying him at the moment. Indeed. What just happened was something I didn't expect. He sighed again and closed his eyes once more as he calmly said, "But this is also good. I hope we can find more of everyone's family members to at least lighten their burdens even a little." Nangongyi seemed to be enjoying the shower as his voice was several volumes lower than normal. "Fortunately, and I didn't touch that girl with the surname Fu. Otherwise it would have been troublesome." "Yeah." Xietain agreed. Even though Nangongyi was stronger than Fu Xiefeng in a head-on battle, if Fu Xiefeng wanted to kill Nangongyi, he only had to wait for the right moment. Fu Xiefeng's main skill was stealth, an unclassified skill. However, he had managed to evolve the skill to First Order Invisibility Level 1. With this skill and a couple more in his arsenal, Nangongyi would have a headache dealing with an enraged Fu Xiefeng. "Well, I don't like getting between the legs of a woman even younger than my little sister." Nangongyi didn't seem too concerned about the matter. Xietain simply chuckled lightly and joked, "Be sure to ask the name of the woman you're going to sleep with just in case." Ha ha ha. After chatting for a couple of minutes, they both fell silent and enjoyed the bubbles that were constantly coming out of the pool. It was as if little hands were constantly massaging them and it felt really exquisite. Time passes very quickly when people were enjoying what they were doing. Without Xietain realizing it, it had already been about 40 minutes since he went into the bath. In fact, he was so comfortable with his current situation that as a consequence of keeping his eyes closed for so long in a pleasant environment, he directly fell asleep. Nangongyi hesitated about waking him up or not, but in the end, decided to leave quietly while trying to make as little noise as possible. Xietain was only 20 years old, but the weight he carried on his shoulders was the fate of thousands of people and the expectations of countless others. Although he usually smiled calmly or acted indifferently, even though Nangongyi had only known him for about 3 or 4 days, it was impossible not to be physically and mentally exhausted. There was no living being capable of withstanding so much pressure without long-term consequences. As if that were not enough, Xietain had confined himself to work immediately after he had suffered terrifyingly painful injuries after a mortal battle with an extremely dangerous enemy that was capable of threatening his own life. It could be said that since the apocalypse erupted with the Soul Record's arrival on Earth, Xietain had not even had a single moment to rest to his heart's content. It was precisely because he considered all this that Nangongyi decided to leave and not wake him up after hearing his heavy but steady breathing. Xietain had a dream. It was a very weird dream, and it was nothing like any dream he had had in the past. In this dream, he saw himself fighting against terrifying existences, being so strong that they could annihilate myriads of races with a wave of their hands and with the power to destroy stars with a single magic spell. But his power was not lower. In his dream, he saw himself wielding a blade even larger than his own body at the same time as a strange being deep inside him gave him apparently endless power. Every swing of his sword caused the heavens to rumble as if crying out in fear, and his magical spells annihilated entire armies. The amount of lives that were claimed by his sword and his magic spells had reached such a large number that the corpses formed mountains and the blood made vast red rivers flow in a seemingly natural way. But as strange as it seemed, he was very angry. The anger was practically irrational to the point where it was difficult to comprehend. Even though it was a dream, it felt so real that the anger even began to affect him. Many tried to stop him. Many others tried to exhaust him using waves of enemies. However, no one was successful. The Xietain of his dream was like an unstoppable killing machine. Regardless of the methods used and regardless of how many enemies came, all were defeated and killed, while those lucky enough could only flee for their lives. It was only after all the enemies were decimated that Xietan's anger in his dream somehow appeared to calm down, even if only minimally. But what most confounded the dream's owner, the real Xietain, was that the thin thread of anger that suddenly disappeared transformed into pain. The pain was so wrenching that his heart squeezed involuntarily. It was a pain he could not comprehend. After crushing everything, the Xietain, who seemingly never exhausted, stuck the tip of his giant sword into the ground and let himself fall while looking up at the sky. His eyes, strangely crimson red, seemed to ask why. Though there was no one to answer a question that was unclear, raindrops began to fall. Blood and crystal water mingled with each other, and long after what felt like an eternal storm with no end, the thickness of the blood began to diminish until it was finally swept away. But even though the blood on the battlefield was swept away, even though the red that tinged the somewhat tattered black plate armor that seemed to have been through countless battles, the hair of that Xietain was still as red as blood. The rain wanted to wash everything away, but the corpses remained there, giving company to the only living being that even after a long time, still looked with his deep red eyes that seemed to be devoid of human emotions towards the sky with a blank stare. More specifically, he seemed to look beyond the skies, something that a normal person could never comprehend. Without knowing how much time passed, Xietain finally opened his eyes and yawned deeply while stretching his arms upward. The sound of flowing water still reached his ears, and the temperature of the water covering his body up to chest height reminded him that he was still in the bath. I fell asleep here? Xietain was speechless and unconsciously forced a bitter smile. However, just when he was wondering why that Nangong dude didn't wake him up, he noticed a particular fragrance and a smile rose on his face automatically. Although the scent of different types of flowers and fruits filled the bathroom, there was a particular fragrance that was impossible for him to mistake: sweet, honeyed, soft, delicate, but surprisingly there was also a slight hint of freshness, an intense but not uncomfortable coldness. It was an extremely uncommon hybrid scent, but a scent to which Xietain had already become familiar. He smiled and turned around to look at the woman sitting at the edge of the pool half a meter away. She was wearing a deep black one-piece dress that covered most of her body. However, her slender white legs were bare while her dainty little feet gently kicked the water at the same time as her tender pearl-like toes embraced the bubbles that slipped in between. Even though the woman was just sitting there, silent, and not performing any exaggerated actions, just the sight of her beautiful beyond all creation face and her smooth legs that looked like mirrors reflecting the dim light indoors was enough to make any living being regardless of gender hold their breath. Who else could she be besides Lilith? She looked up at him with her red eyes as intense as fire and as bright as rubies. A glint of imperceptible worry flashed momentarily in her eyes before disappearing like a stone dropped in the middle of the never-ending ocean. Aren't you afraid of drowning to death? She puckered her lips in a slightly taunting but slightly reassured smile. Her voice was soft, as smooth as velvet to the touch, and seemed to meld with the sound of the water gurgling steadily. In no way out of place, on the contrary, it seemed to add even more calm to the already peaceful scene. Xietain sighed and shook his head as he jokingly said, "That fella Nangong walked off without me and left me here. Really an irresponsible person, he. Aren't you the only irresponsible one here?" Lilith giggled with a weak smile. She was like a naive little girl when she acted this way, a stark contrast to her body that was capable of arousing the most nefarious thoughts of the holiest man in the world. In fact, it was this kind of contradiction that was strangely in sync that made Xietan's stone heart itch as if a small cat's claw was scratching the palm of his hand. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 269. Lu Yen. Although the amount of time Xietain had spent together with Lilith since the apocalypse broke out and his life completely changed was more than the time he had spent with anyone else, he still couldn't get used to such a dazzling beauty as hers. The charm surrounding her was simply too overwhelming for a first-order existence, and Xietain had no doubt that if it wasn't for her holding herself back, he could become her puppet in a second. Snapping out of his trance, he looked away slyly and yawned, "I guess it's time to go to bed. Although I'm not afraid of drowning here, it's not like I can fall asleep for the rest of the night in the bathroom. Yup. We should go to bed quickly." Lilith giggled softly and her pearly teeth peeked slightly between her hot red lips. Xietain rolled his eyes and said in a stiff tone, "Anyway, can you go out or do something about it?" I'd like to dry off. At this moment, Xietain had a towel around his waist. However, the water had made the towel stick to his body naturally, so the area of his crotch would be distinguishable when he stood up. Even if there was still the cloth covering the skin, Lilith was a woman he respected after all, and he didn't want to disrespect her in any way. Oh. About that. Lilith thought about it for a moment and tilted her head to the side in a cute way before saying in a sweet voice, "Just ignore my presence. You can do your business without worrying about me." The corner of Xietan's mouth twitched continuously as if he had a nervous twitch when he heard what she said, and for a moment he was at a loss as to how to react to it. He was supposed to stand up and then casually remove his covering, standing naked like when his mother brought him into this world, in front of a woman? Wouldn't that be a little too weird? After all, while it was true that Xietain trusted Lilith and even considered her a good friend, the relationship between them had not reached that point, had it? However, seeing that she seemed to be serious, Xietain also stopped overthinking and stood up. Lilith did not act naughty this time. She looked at him with her red eyes as bright as the most beautiful gem in the creation, and her pure gaze did not stray to the lower half of his body. She continued to look at him curiously and simply seemed to want to see what kind of reactions he had. Unfortunately for Lilith, Xietan's expression remained calm and indifferent like most of the time. He even casually took off the towel that was barely doing anything to hide his body and began casually drying himself before finally putting on a bathrobe to cover his body. "Let's go then?" He looked at her and gestured towards the door. "Let's go then." Lilith floated slightly and stopped a step short. Xietain opened the doors and headed to the top floor under the guidance of a maid who was still waiting for him outside. Meanwhile, Lilith was following him closely, but the maiden did not know about her existence. Her feet were still bare, and their perfection was such that sometimes they seemed to be shinier than the marble floor, counteracting its purity. Northwest zone of the base. While Kong Rong controlled practically 100% of the power in the south, Liu Yan controlled that same much in the north. The two men used to get along relatively well in the past, despite their differences, as they knew that neither could defeat the other without suffering greatly, which forced them to coexist. However, after Liu Yan's only daughter was almost taken advantage of by Kong Rong's trashy son, the subtle relationship between the two men finally broke down when Liu Yan demanded him to hand over his son, which Kong Rong naturally refused. Kong Rong had no family, and the only thing he had left in this world apart from the power he had earned after much scheming was his son Kong Hong. Whatever his son did, Kong Rong would always be there to support him even if the heavens fell. Unfortunately, it was precisely this that caused Kong Rong to be taken down by Xietan's group, because if not for Kong Hong forcing the Nangong family into a corner, Xietain, who was aiming for the south of Yanqing district, would definitely never move in a northerly direction, which would lead him to find this camp of survivors. Inside a luxurious 3-story villa, the lights were practically completely on even though it was already close to 2 a.m. The outdoor courtyard had many high-powered spotlights that illuminated the perimeter not only inside, but also 2 kilometers around the grounds. There was not even a shadow except those that were simply impossible to hide from, such as that of human beings in motion. There were no armed men present, however, this did not mean that the place was devoid of life. On the contrary, there were many humans around. They were all powerful soul evolvers, and the count had reached approximately 80 of them. The atmosphere was extremely tense at this time, and the faces of the usually confident soul evolvers had a tinge of fear on them as they cautiously looked at their surroundings. They reacted to the slightest hint of sound as if a prehistoric beast was about to make its appearance. Inside the living room of the villa, a man who looked to be about 40 years old, with several white hairs adorning his dark mane, was drinking a cup of hot coffee. His face was quite handsome, despite his age, and his body looked quite in shape. However, at this moment there was a slight frown between his brows, making it known that there were things bothering him even though he looked so calm on the surface. Next to the man was a young woman of about 18 years old. She could be considered quite pretty. Although she was not an outstanding first-rate beauty, her silky hair down to the middle of her back and her small pure white oval face created a strong contrast to each other. Her duck yellow dress gave her an extremely sweet appearance, and even though her body did not seem to be fully developed yet, it could be seen that when she fully grew up she would be a real peach. The man was actually Lu Yen, who was actually 50 years old, but thanks to purifying his soul by absorbing the soul power of other beings, he looked younger than he really was. As for the innocent-looking pretty young girl next to him, she was his daughter, Lu Xiaoyao. Xiaoyao, why don't you go to your room? It's already late, and it's not good for a young lady like you to stay up late at night. Lu Yen put down the half-empty coffee cup on the glass coffee table in front of him and looked at his young daughter with eyes filled with tenderness. Father, you don't need to insist anymore. Since I said I would accompany you in hard times, I will accompany you even if I can't do much. Lu Xiaoyao shook her head without hesitation. Lu Yen could only force a smile at his daughter's words. She was usually sensible and listened to him, but when it came to matters that were really difficult and his safety was at risk, she would become a stubborn person unwilling to give in no matter what. Lu Yan's wife and Lu Xiaoyao's mother had unfortunately been unable to resist the wave of mana that assaulted her body during the first day of the apocalypse, so she transformed into a mindless zombie. Similar to Kong Rong, Lu Yen only had his daughter at the moment, and she was what he cherished most in his life. It was precisely because of this that when he learned that his daughter was almost abused by Kong Rong's son, Lu Yen did not hesitate to break off all relations with the other side and even stir up several troubles whenever the opportunity arose. If not for the fact that the strength between the two sides was quite similar and it was difficult to know who would come out as the winner, Lu Yen would have already risked everything to seek revenge. However, he could not do that until he was completely sure. After all, if his forces were defeated, his precious daughter might end up suffering a fate more miserable than death. Lu Yen was always looking for an opportunity to deal a fatal blow to the faction of Kong Rong. However, Kong Rong was also a cunning fox who did not show his tail, leaving Lu Yen with his hands raised in the air without being able to lower them. But things seemed to be different tonight. Until about 2 hours ago, the sound of gunfire reached from the southeast of the privileged area to the northeast, so Lu Yen was immediately alerted by his men, who informed him that a group was apparently launching an offensive directly against Kong Rong's villa. Unfortunately, the distance between the southeastern and northeastern areas was more than a dozen kilometers, so Lu Yen had no way of knowing what was going on there since that area did not belong to him and any approach could cause really big problems. Until now, he had been waiting for an answer. Suddenly, the sound of hurried footsteps came from outside and Lu Yan's expression changed slightly before returning to normal. Apparently, the answers to his doubts had finally arrived. Moments later, a robust, muscular man who looked like a walking tower walked into the living room. This man was wearing a military uniform that didn't fit him too well because of his oversized arms, but the terrifying glint in his eyes told anyone that his muscles weren't the only thing terrifying about him. This person was Lu Yan's most powerful soul evolver and his number one trusted man. His name was Yen Tu, and this year he was 38 years old. Boss Lu, young miss. Yen Tu bowed slightly to Lu Yen and nodded towards Lu Xiaoyao. He had been taken care of by Lu Yen in the past, when he was nothing more than a poor bastard left to fend for himself in the world, one who had lost everything. Then, with Lu Yan's help, Yen Tu managed to evolve properly and then continued to evolve even further until finally reaching where he was today. Hi, Uncle Yen. Lu Xiaoyao smiled sweetly. She had known Yen Tu since she was little, so it could be said that they got along quite well. Yen Tu, any news about what happened in the southeast of the base? Lu Yen went straight to the subject since it was what concerned him at the moment. He unconsciously brought the cup of coffee to his mouth and emptied it in one gulp. Yen Tu's expression was a little weird as he said in a somewhat stiff tone of voice, Kong Rong. That fat greaseball was actually destroyed. Bang! Lu Yen could not control his strength and the glass cup in his hands was shattered as a look brimming with disbelief glittered in his eyes that grew wider and wider with each passing second. Father! Lu Xiaoyao was also shocked when she heard the news. However, seeing her father's hand bleeding after being cut by the broken glass, the girl was frightened and couldn't help but scream out loud. Lu Yen did not seem to hear his daughter, nor did he seem to notice the blood on his hand, nor did he seem to feel any pain at all. Slowly, he stood up and asked, with difficulty, You. Yen Tuesday. Just now. What did you say? Yen Tu scratched his head and said still stiffly, Kong Rong is finished. And apparently, this was all done by only 3 people. Blood Warlock, Succubus Partner in the Apocalypse. Chapter 270 Getting a Good Thing Only to Lose It Soon After. 3 people. The last words pronounced by Yen Tu echoed in the air for what seemed like an eternity as the father and daughter pair stood stupefied. Lu Xiaoyao might not know the exact level of power that Kong Rong controlled, however, she was naturally aware of the vast amount of forces that her father commanded. Precisely because of this reason, she could have a rough idea of how strong Kong Rong and his faction were. Since her father, who loved her more than his own life and cared for her as if she were a baby, had not yet moved against Kong Rong, then Lu Xiaoyao, who was a smart girl, naturally concluded that her father did not have enough power to wipe out the father and son pair under the surname Kong. Simply put, the power her father controlled was roughly equivalent to that of Kong Rong. However, Yen Tu had just said that only 3 people defeated Kong Rong, who was under the protection of hundreds of soldiers and dozens of powerful soul evolvers. Lu Xiaoyao could not believe it. She jumped up from the expensive leather couch she was sitting on and shook her head while exclaiming, "Impossible. Uncle Yen, are you sure you're not making a mistake? How can 3 people take down Kong Rong's forces in such a short time?" It wasn't that Lu Xiaoyao didn't want to believe it, it was that she simply couldn't do it. "Yen Tu, are you sure about this?" Lu Yen asked in a deep voice. Even for himself, it was hard to believe what he had just heard despite the fact that he already knew that a person like Yen Tu would never say empty words. No matter how much Lu Yen wanted to dismember Kong Rong and his son into a million pieces because of the bad experience his precious daughter Lu Xiaoyao went through, he knew how strong the other party was, or else he would not have stood idly by without being able to do anything until today. Yen Tu forced a smile and raised both hands as he said in confusion, "Boss Lu, to be honest, even I find it hard to believe. Even under the protection of so many men, Kong Rong was captured alive while Shan Li was killed on the spot." "What?" Lu Yen lost his composure this time. Shan Li didn't flee, but was killed? Shan Li, an extremely scary man with the ability to control the gravitational force within a certain area, affecting whoever he targeted. This man was actually the main reason why Lu Yen did not dare to attack Kong Rong until now. Because Yen Tu and Shan Li had secretly exchanged blows several days ago, but neither of them managed to get the upper hand over the other. In other words, the strength of both of them was quite similar even if they were holding back unless one of them was hiding a terrifyingly strong skill. But such a person was killed? Tell me everything you've learned. I want details, everything you know. Lu Yen took a deep breath and his voice became tiresome. Yen Tu nodded and sat on the couch opposite Lu Yan's, and was about to start narrating when Lu Xiaoyao interrupted while looking at his father's severed hand. "Father, Uncle Yen. Please wait a moment. First, we have to treat the wound on your hand." She waved to a maid and ordered the maid to get a soul evolver to treat her father's wound. The maid returned shortly thereafter with a rather thin and not too striking man. In fact, his current appearance was more on the ugly side as there were several acne marks on his face. "Chief Lu, Lord Yen, young Miss Lu." The man's voice was a bit hoarse and judging by his red eyes, it was obvious that he was sleeping but was awakened in the middle of the night. Yen Tu nodded slightly and remained silent. On the other hand, Lu Xiaoyao immediately pointed to his father's bleeding hand and hurriedly said, "Quickly, use your skill to heal my father." When the man saw a maiden cleaning the broken glass, he naturally understood what happened. However, seeing the few drops of blood falling to the floor and the superficial cuts on Lu Yan's hand, the corner of his mouth twitched several times. He was woken up in the middle of the night and instructed that he needed to treat Chief Lu Yen for a wound, so he hurriedly left the warmth of his bed and half-dressed to run here. Little did he expect to encounter this kind of wound. "Sorry for the trouble, Wan Jian." Lan Yu forced a smile and sighed in his heart. Such kind of wound would be fine with some alcohol and some gauze, but his daughter made so much drama for nothing. Still, her care for him was genuine, so he couldn't complain about it either. "Don't worry. It's my job after all." The man named Wan Jian naturally understood the situation. In any case, his only job was to heal when it was required, and in return, he enjoyed great luxury treatment so he couldn't complain even if he was woken up at such early hours of the morning. Soon, a white light glowed in Wan Jian's hand. That ball of light flew to Lu Yan's hand and a second later, the wound stopped bleeding. Lu Xiaoyao took a wet towel brought by a maid and wiped the blood from her father's hand. Her eyes lit up as she saw that there was no trace of wound present. Lu Yan's wound was just too insignificant after all. Even if he was just a normal human instead of a soul evolver, a single activation of Wen Jian's skill was all that was needed to heal it. Great! She exclaimed. Wen Jian looked at Lu Yan and said through tears and laughter, Chief Lu, if there's nothing else you need, I'll go back to my place. Lu Yan nodded, thank you for everything, just like always. Wen Jian was the only healer in the whole base. Even Kong Rong did not have a person capable of healing. Wen Jian's skill was the same skill as Kong Lan's, lesser healing. That's how rare healers were. Among more than 5,000 survivors in total, only 2 had the power of healing. After Wen Jian departed, the maidens again retreated from the room and closed the doors behind. So, Yan Tuesday. Can you start now? Lu Yan asked with some anxiety in his voice. Lu Xiaoyao also had a serious expression on her face and all her attention was focused on her hearing, not wanting to miss anything she was going to hear next. Yes. Yan Tu nodded and began to explain everything he knew. It turned out that because the southeast was an area that belonged to the counterpart, Lu Yan's group could not approach to avoid trouble. Moreover, tonight the southeastern area was especially hectic and Kong Rong's troops even abandoned the safety of the walls and the rest of the base to move quickly there. All this made Lu Yan unable to send anyone as he did not want to get involved in a war against an unknown group that was brave enough to attack one of the most powerful people in the whole base, and to top it off, in his own house under the security of a large armed troop and evolved men. However, when Kong Rong was overthrown and his troops defeated, everything became easier. Yan Tu spent a large amount of supplies to pay one of the officers who had been on the scene from the beginning, so he easily found out the whole truth and how the events happened. After he finished telling what he knew so far, Yan Tu continued, the person who told me all this definitely couldn't be lying unless he had been brainwashed with a skill. The fear in his eyes and the astonishment in his voice as he narrated the events can't be faked, and even if it can be, I don't think such a thing would slip past me. Lu Yan's expression remained unchanged as he listened to everything. He lowered his head and plunged into deep thoughts without commenting on it. Father. Lu Xiaoyao muttered in a low voice as she looked at her only family with worry. Everything she had just heard seemed to be straight out of a horror story, a fantasy told by a 5-year-old child. If everything Yan Tu said was really like that, then the strength of the other party was just colossal. A beautiful woman whose body was incredibly seductive with a powerful barrier capable of blocking thousands of bullets regardless of their caliber. Another woman as beautiful as a fairy, even more terrifying than the previous one, with the ability to make ice out of thin air, whose agility was as fast as that of ghosts, and with a sword prowess as high as that of movie experts. This woman's power was such that she even defeated one of Kong Rong's most powerful soul evolvers with a single swing of her sword and pushed dozens of soul evolvers into a corner with her presence. On the other hand, there was also a young man dressed in black who from start to finish never used his weapon. He only showed his power near the end, when the group of 3 finally reached Kong Rong's villa. More precisely, when fighting Shanli. Lu Xiaoyao did not know how strong Shanli was, but she knew that Yan Tu was very powerful. However, Yan Tu had once told her that his chances of defeating Shanli were no more than 60%, and even if he won, killing him would be more difficult than ascending to the heavens. But such Shanli was completely overwhelmed and crushed. The confrontation between that young man and Shanli could not be called anything but total suppression. Able to control the blood of the dead, monstrously high physical strength, intelligence, and brilliant thoughts, this was the way the officer who reported everything he had seen to Yan Tu described that young man. The details were not too much since the eyesight of the officer, a normal human, naturally could not follow the speed and movements of first-level soul evolvers. Besides, it was obvious to assume that this person had also missed many things that happened in between. But only what they knew was enough for Lu Xiaoyao, as smart as she was, to realize that a tiger even more terrifying than Kong Rong had emerged. After a long time, Lu Yan sighed and looked at Yan Tu before asking without much hope, "Do you have confidence in defeating these people?" Normal firearms were clearly useless against this group, and the camp had no heavy weaponry or military vehicles with strategic power. Lu Yan could only rely on the soul evolvers under his command. Yen Tu smiled bitterly and shook his head. Don't joke, Boss Lu. If that guy really did kill Shanli. Regardless of whether it was as easy as that officer described or not, the fact that this person had the power to make Shanli, who could become swift after activating his skill on himself, stay there forever. That alone is enough to know that I can't defeat him. Lu Yen was briefly stunned before a bitter smile grew on his face. He looked at the records imprinted into his soul and said without knowing whether to laugh or cry, I just received something good a few hours ago, but apparently I'll lose it even before I can even taste it. Among his records, there was one that awarded him with the lower leader subclass.